So there's been a few changes to the non-combustibility requirements in the code. And I mentioned before about permitting certain types of wall sarking as a deemed to satisfy solution, which is one of those changes that's, I think we've all been trying to get to the bottom of this for a little while about, does it need to be non-combustible, or could it just meet a flammability index for the sarking when it's shielded in the wall?
Just one thing,
Yep.
Simon, this is just something we found. Why do we refer to it as wall sarking when it should be isolation? Wall usually isolation refers to the wall, and sarking refers to the roof.
Yep.
And so it's kind of confusing that.
The code uses it interchangeably, and it uses the defined term sarking type material.
Yeah, because
Yep.
I mean, in the energy efficiency world, you use isolation.
Yep.
This isolation is part of the membrane.
Yep. Yep.
This is the water
Yep.
membrane, so
Yep.
I don't know why that.
Yeah.
It's confusing.
It uses, the code has reflective foil laminate, it has vapor permeable membrane, it has sarking type material, it has, you talk about sisolation, there's about...
Well, I just think it's sarking on the roof, that's what
Yeah. Yep.
It's a shame that they always muck it up somewhere.
Yep. Yeah. Probably for this one, it's in the context that it is talked about for external walls.
Yeah.
So that's probably the one difference. But there are different fire hazard property requirements where it's just, it might be underneath the roof, so the material.
No, in fact, there's quite specific about saying wall sarking.
Yep.
You just do isolation, you say that's the wall.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. So there's more work there because there's a lot of those terms are probably creating confusion in the terminologies being used and things like that. So it's something that really probably part of the condensation work they need to look at more broadly going forward, as well as the fire safety stuff.
That's isolation test, that's the breathable part.
Yeah.
I guess that's
Yeah. So another one has been about, it's not a change, this one, but it's the retention of the bonded laminates clause in the code. And I'll go into more detail on these things as we go through it. And then there's an expanded list of certain ancillary products that are exempt from the non-combustibility requirements. I'll also mention about some changes to now permit the fire-protected timber to be used for all classes of building as well. And there's a few other changes there. But before I get into talking about the changes, something that I've done around the country has been about just to remind people what the actual non-combustibility requirements are in the code. Because it's good to talk about what the changes are, but it's important to talk about what the actual requirements are. And so this is under the deemed to satisfy provisions. So under the deemed to satisfy provisions, under clause C1.1, it has table C1.1, which outlines the minimum type of fire resisting requirements based on the class of building and the rise in story. So what you'll notice there is a grouping of class 2, 3 and 9 buildings. And what do those 3 buildings have in common? Where people sleep and have also about high occupancy in public assembly buildings. Yep. As you say, they're higher risk buildings. So as you would expect for those types of buildings, they have higher levels of fire safety requirements, their type of construction. So the code has 3 types of construction. Type A construction is the highest level, where type C is the least fire resistant requirements. Type A and B are generally non-combustible requirements. Okay, so there it sends you to C1.9 and it says, in a building required to be of type A and B construction, the following elements and their components must be non-combustible. And then it clarifies that external walls and common walls, including all components incorporated in them, including the facade, covering, framing and insulation, must be non-combustible. So this was previously spread over a number of different parts to the code, but now it's up in C1.9 to make it much clearer about the requirements. This was incorporated into the outer cycle amendment that came into effect in March of last year. But when this was after the La Crosse fire in Melbourne and the VBA, the Victorian Building Authority, did their advisory note, and then the ABCB subsequently did their advisory note, everyone was talking about the external wall from outside to inside and everything incorporated therein needs to be non-combustible. And then all of these questions started to arise. How about the sarking in the wall? How about, packing that might be in the wall? How about a socket, electrical socket on the outside of a building? How about tapes? How about paint? How about this? How about that? I even had a question where someone said, how about an automatic teller machine? that's in an external wall, does that need to be non-combustible? So this is where the overreaction of certain things happened here. Not to be flippant on the issue, you know, we've seen the facade fires around the country, and there's, you know, it's a significant issue. But there has been that overreaction of everything, of going, oh, everything needs to be non-combustible. There's nothing that could be done there, and you know, things like sarking and other things have then gone, how about this? How about that? We've seen scenarios where people have asked for a non-combustibility test certificate for a brick or concrete, or asked for a 5113 test certificate for brick or concrete. So we've had this big overreaction across the board on some of this stuff. So some of these provisions in the code hopefully are starting to go some way to improving it this time around, rather than that started in that outer cycle amendment, and now there's been some further clarifications this time around as well. So still explaining C1.9 a little bit. So C1.9A has those requirements about the external wall, the common walls. Then you have C1B that talks about other types of fire, you know, walls that might be around a fire, a lift shaft and other things like that. Then it gets down to subclause E. And subclause E says that the following materials may be used wherever a non-combustible material is required, and lists a number of products that have a proven history of performance but don't need to use the AS 1530 Part 1 non-combustibility test. They've got a proven history of performance. They might have an element within them that would therefore mean that it would not meet that test. So for instance, a pre-finished metal sheeting, where it might be a corrugated iron sheeting that might have a paint coating over that material, that paint coating would mean that it would fail, you know, essentially the 1530 Part 1 test, which is a furnace test that you have a specimen of the material dropped into this furnace. It's heated up to 700 degrees Celsius, and it's not supposed to sustain flaming for more than 30 minutes. So it's a test that's really developed for homogeneous materials, not for things that are sort of composite type materials. So as I mentioned before, that a lot of people were asking the question, how about sarking in the wall? Does it need to meet the fire hazard property requirements in C1.10, or does it need to meet the non-combustibility requirements? At another time, we're also looking at the condensation management provisions in the code, and we're going to be asking for vapor permeable membranes. From my knowledge, I don't know if there's such a thing as a non-combustible vapor permeable breathable membrane. It's sort of a bit of a counter to the two things. So, you know, it was accepted that this would be that sarking type materials wouldn't need to meet the non-combustibility requirements, provided they're shielded within the wall system, you know, and they also meet a flammability index of not greater than 5, and they don't exceed 1 millimetre in thickness. So majority of the products, you know, your typical building wrap type of products are 0.4 of a mil, you know, maybe 0.7. Tim, I think yours are 0.2 or something like that, is it? Or they're about, yeah, 0.22. So majority of your wall wrap type of products, but when you get into more the rigid type boards, they would still need to meet the non-combustibility requirements or be done via a performance solution. Another change, it's not really a change, it was a retention of the bonded laminates clause in the code. And if you were looking at the public comment draft of the code, this was proposed to be removed. Part of this, there was concerns about the performance of some of these composite materials. There was also concern about how some of them might have been being advertised, you know, in terms of them being a non-combustible material, where this is under a clause that, you know, allows for products to be used where a non-combustible material would be required, so a deemed non-combustible material. There was a lot of there was some changes that were clarified in the outer cycle amendment in March last year, where people were uncertain or had misinterpreted or otherwise, that this clause applied broader than just saying that it was, and the clause got clarified that each laminate, including the core of these panels, need to be non-combustible. But what it does allow for is the binding agents, the glues, you know, to be actually, you know, combustible, because you're not getting non-combustible glues. So this is the thing that binds it all together, but there's limitations on the thickness of those glues, 1 millimetre thickness, and you're allowed to have 2 components all up. So therefore, and then it also, the panel as a whole would need to meet a spread of flame and smoke develop indices. So the clause had been retained because the ABCB was approached and realised that there was a lot of products that use this clause in the code. There's some panels that might be 200 mil thick panels that are fully non-combustible but have the outside laminates that might be, different composite materials, and then they're glued onto that panel. And that's that glue then triggers it into it being considered a composite material. So there's a lot of different products in it, and a lot of the stuff that had been clarified in the out-of-cycle amendment overcame that issue where people may have of the view that the internal core didn't need to be non-combustible, it was only the external elements that needed to be.
So they would have to be tested to ES1530?
So the laminates themselves do, but then
those components would have to be tested individually?
they're either tested individually or they might be the same thing. They might all be non-combustible materials. Yep. Yep.
Composite materials.
Yep.
Because they have to be tested individually, and we know
Yep.
that polyethylene
Yep.
sandwich in between those.
Yep.
Aluminium. We failed the test.
Yep.
But nonetheless, that test has to
Yep.
confirm
Yep.
it would be the same as that.
Yeah. So for those ones, this is really what it's been clarifying: is each of those cores need to be non-combustible, but the glues that bind it together are allowed to be. Cores that are combustible cores, not acceptable under the deemed to satisfy, that have to be considered as a performance solution if best. Yep. Another change, and this is in C1.9 and this comes to that point that I mentioned before about people asking questions, how about this element, and saying, and the code acknowledges that there's certain elements that don't need to meet the non-combustibility requirements. Gaskets, corking, sealants, damp-proof courses, all these things that we've never, ever really, what contribution would they have to the fire spread themselves? Would be minimal at best. You couldn't build the building if you didn't have these elements within it. So really important to, that this acknowledges it. There's also some other ones listed in C1.14 that are exempt from the requirements as well. I think for this one, we're probably going to see a bit of a moving beast, because once you start listing some in the code, if you don't list everything, then someone go, how about this, how about that, how about that? So they've got a few in here, but I can see 2022 that more people are going to say, how about thermal breaks as part of a wall system? How about this, how about that? And going forward, we'll see this list expanded. I could see very much so. And this sort of relates a little bit to that last one. So in addition to having non-combustibility requirements, there's also concurrent provisions in C1.10 which apply to materials and linings within a building, which have to control their fire hazard properties. So which is about the tenability of the building when there might be a fire or smoke. So there's some products that can control that sort of the tenability environment. And C1.10 lists a number of products, and then similarly, when you get down to C, it has some products that don't need to meet the fire hazard properties requirements. One of those questions was about, how about hollow core doors? Hollow core doors are commonly used in class 2 to 9 buildings, in particular internal doors within an SO occupancy unit. And it previously said, pretty much solid timber doors or face doors. And we all know that commonly people are using these hollow core doors, and what contribution would they have? What is the risk? And it was acknowledged that, yes, these should be accepted as exempt from the fire hazard property requirements. There's another one listed there, which really is, I think, how a lot of people had interpreted it and applied it anyway in the past. So moving into the next change, which is about the fire-protected timber. So many of you will remember about in 2015, 2016, there was changes incorporated into the code to allow for fire-protected timber to be used in lieu of the non-combustibility requirements. That pretty much gave an equivalent level of fire safety to a non-combustible wall for using fire-protected timber. That might be your CLT, mass timber panels, or it might be your stick timbers with dual-sided fire-protected coverings. At the time, it only incorporated for Class 2, Class 3 and Class 5 buildings. They've now been extended to all classes of building up to an effective height of 25 metres. It still needs to be sprinkler protected and have those other elements there. This one I think is going to have those advantages over where you have those mixed-use buildings, where in the past you may have, over the last few years, if you wanted to do this, you may have had to do concrete and masonry for parts of it, using fire-protected timbers for other parts to it when you have the mixed use, where this will allow the fire-protected timber for all of those classes of building up to 25 metres in effective height. So moving into the next change, and this is, as I mentioned at the outset, and Vanessa just put a little bit more comment about this, was about the mandatory sprinkler protection provisions into the code. And these are going to apply to Class 2 and 3 buildings that are 4 stories and above. Well, sorry, with a rising story of 4 and above, sorry. And where did this come from, this provision? This was something that's been discussed many times over the years around the Building Codes Committee table and others around. And in 2012, there was a tragic fire in Bankstown in Sydney, and a couple of girls tragically lost their lives in those buildings, and a corrodial inquest into that made a recommendation to consider mandating sprinkler protection for these types of buildings. So this was undertaken, that was forwarded to the Australian Building Codes Board, who considered it and put forward a couple of options and did a consultation and did a regulation impact analysis. One of the options included having either an optional deemed to satisfy, so you either follow the deemed to satisfy, or you keep your passive protection that would have been applied for the best part of the last 40, 50 years in terms of this, so up to 25 metres where the provisions are generally triggered, or have it mandatory. The Fire Protection Association of Australia and the Fire and Rescue New South Wales put together some work and put together a proposal to the Building Codes Board that would essentially, in their mind, be a cost-effective solution which provides some offsets in terms of putting the sprinklers in and getting offsets from a passive construction perspective, and then also putting some cheaper sprinkler specifications in the code. And that essentially, in the end of the day, the Australian Building Codes Board supported that, though noting that the regulation impact statement did support the optional approach, and that optional approach has been the thing that's been in the Victorian additions for many, many years as that alternate approach to passive and active. So how does this get called up? Under table E1.5 in the code, where you had your common one, which was where a building has an effective height of greater than 25, has an effective height greater than 25, that you'd require sprinkler protection for all classes of building. It now has for Class 2 and 3 buildings that where it has a rise in stories of 4 or more, or less than 25, that you would need to have that sprinkler protection. It's written that way because there are some conditions around the 4 stories, rising stories of 4 up to 25 metres in effective height, for those offsets and for those those concessions and for those use of those sprinkler specifications, where when you're over 25 metres they wouldn't apply. So some of the permitted concessions include that where you, so to have this one, you can have some reduced FRLs. That might be for your service penetrations, and for some of your fire-rated walls around your lift shafts can have a reduced FRL. You can have a reduced travel distance within the SOU, increased travel distance in the SOU, and then for the building itself have a maximum distance of travel extended as well, which really for that one they can also, and the distance between the alternate exits, so depending on the design, may be able to utilise this to come up with a single fire exit as opposed to 2 fire exits. So there are some, and these do change a little bit in terms of those concessions based on the sprinkler specifications. And so the sprinkler specifications that have been incorporated into the code, you still can use your 2118 Part 1 system. Then you can use your 2118, I think it's Part 4 or Part 6, which is your domestic system. And then there's 2 new specifications being developed by the Fire Protection Association. One of them is FPAA 101D, which is for your domestic water supply. And then is FPAA 101H, which is for your hydrant water supply. And with 101D is intended to be the most cost-effective of the options. I should note though that for these provisions, you still would need to use your 2118 sprinkler standard, but then you would have your fire protection standard there that gives you some offsets to the requirements. And it might say, for this clause, you need not comply with it. You may use this in lieu of it. So you need to use the 2 of them concurrently when you're actually applying it. It's not a self-contained standard in its own right. They both are referenced in the code as deemed to satisfy reference documents. So does anyone have any questions on the fire safety stuff that I've mentioned before I get into the next part of the presentation? So majority of products, if they comply with AS 4200 Part 1, that's a requirement in 4200 Part 1 anyway. So majority of the products that you've got in the system are lower than, have a flame that's less than 5 anyway. Yeah, I think Tim's, yours is about 0.2 or 0.1 or something like that, or 1.
The wrap is 0.2 and the flammability index and the flammability index is 1.
Yeah, so majority of the ones that, from our understanding, would fall under that, and that is aligned with a lot of international approaches to this, where they might have things like limited combustibility clauses in their code, that they have, that most of those products are under that flammability index criteria. Yep. 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 We saw some that nearly did the hokey pokey. They had to, you need to take it off and put non-combustible on, and now the code's put it out for public comment, it's going to be okay, and then it's, no. Yes, so there was a bit of this back and forward, so hopefully we now finally have some certainty on this, and going forward we won't have to deal with this issue again. Yeah. Okay, I'll keep going. Okay, similarly to what I mentioned this morning about the change to the health and amenity requirements, where that's going to now allow for the use of a water-resistant junction rather than a waterproof junction. And again, I think this is really relevant in a volume 1 sense, when you have your European laundry cupboards and other things like that as well. Another change, which lo and behold, something's actually been taken out of the code. You wouldn't believe it. Usually we never see stuff taken out, it's only added in. But a change that's been incorporated, which very much came from a lot of people in the room giving feedback to us and others, that these old janitor's room requirement for where you needed to have a sanitary facility for a Class 2 and 3 building where you had more than 10 SOUs for the Class 2. That's now been removed, and a lot of this room was, as we know, was stored for mops and buckets and all sorts of things. It wasn't essentially being used in a great extent for its purpose. There might be other work health and safety obligation requirements, but from a code perspective, this is seen as increased floor areas, regulatory reduction type of thing that could be done, and was seen as a positive. Something that, when they could go, do we really need this requirement in the code itself? Another one that's probably, it's not a change to the code, but I wanted to flag it with you, is something that I think is a really good initiative that the Building Codes Board has done. They've developed a new calculator. We've got the glazing calculator, the lighting calculator. We've even got a calculator for how many downpipes and overflow measures. There's a new one, and this is something that we commonly would get asked, is how many facilities do I need for this building? How many hand basins, how many urinals, how many toilets, how many ambulance facilities, how many, all of this sort of stuff. And it's a complicated process in how you work that number out. So the ABCB has developed a calculator to assist you all in terms of working out what those numbers are. And I've kept and it's not on their website just yet, but will be available shortly. They keep telling me that though. They did tell me it was going to be available at the end of last year, and then they told me March. March is gone. Yeah, soon. But it was out for beta testing, and it was a really good document, a really good calculator, and I think it will help all of you because it is a complicated process. So getting into the condensation management provisions, and we did talk about these this morning, so I won't go into a lot of details. I'll just try and point out where the things might differ. And we know with condensation, and in particular with apartments, even more than houses, where we see this condensation build up in the apartments, and that risk there for yourselves as builders, designers, engineers, in terms of you're involved in all of this. Really important to have that bit about. It's not going to ensure that you won't have condensation appear in the building. It's there to minimise the impact. So that new verification method, and it clarifies that it only applies to Class 2 buildings and Class 4 parts of a building. There's the verification method there, which might be a bit more applicable to a Volume 1 sense, but I know the majority is still going to be using the deemed to satisfy, but that's that risk assessment one I mentioned this morning. It has an application in the part to clarify that thing about it only applies to the SOU of a Class 2 or Class 4 part, and that explanatory information about minimisation and managing the risk. The provisions for the fabric, for the pliable membrane, applies as per Volume 2 in terms of the use of vapour permeable membranes for 6, 7 and 8, but does provide the exclusion for single skin masonry and single skin concrete. One of the things I will point out that does differ is that for a kitchen or laundry, particularly the kitchen range hoods, that under clause F6.3b, it does clarify it prescribes that for a exhaust from a kitchen, it must be discharged directly via a lift shaft or a duct to the outdoor air. So the recirculating range hoods wouldn't be applicable for use in a Class 2 building anymore, based on this clause. So it'll need to duct to the outside or into a ceiling space or a roof space. And as we know, with these types of buildings, it can be more complicated. You might have to look at things like riser shafts and the treatment of those riser shafts through fire-rated building elements. So it's one of those ones that you probably want to start to factor into your designs going forward. Pardon? Yep, it can be that. Yeah, it depends how you do it. There's a few different options and how, but some might be a riser shaft throughout the whole dwelling, or it could be a slab to ceiling. Yeah. No, it just needs to be duct to the outside. Yeah. There is when you're in the roof space, there is the ventilation requirements when you're in that roof space. But that's really for the other ones, because for kitchen exhausts, it is going to need to duct to the outside. One thing I didn't mention this morning, which I probably should have, so apologies, is that even if you do have a openable window within that room, just say you have in your bathroom or your sanitary compartment, and you already have an openable window in that room, if you go and then put in a fan, an exhaust fan there, that would need to be ducted. Okay, even though you're putting it in voluntarily, the code doesn't require it, but if you do put it there, it doesn't allow you. It doesn't give you it doesn't say that therefore that because you're already meeting your natural ventilation and lighting requirements, you would still need to duct that exhaust. Where previously there was explanatory information in the code that did give you that option. If you did have that there, and it was there put in voluntarily, you didn't need to have that ducting, but that's now been removed.